So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about how that land gained from Mexico, aka the Mexican Cession, which gave the United States California and New Mexico, which again, was a combination of Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Colorado, parts of Utah. We're going to look at how that really sort of blows up once California wants to become part of the Union after the gold rush in 1849. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, again, a transcendentalist like Henry David Thoreau, who wouldn't pay his poll taxes during the Mexican-American War, very much opposed to slavery. He says the United States will conquer Mexico. Everybody knows that. But it will be as the man who swallows arsenic. Mexico will poison us. And what he's saying is the land gained from Mexico will be so problematic to this country in terms of dividing the North and the South in the arguments over slavery. And he was incredibly prophetic when he said that. Now, we're now in the countdown, our second 13er. So the first 13er was from the end of the French and Indian War, 1763, to the American Revolution, 1776. This 13er is from the end of the Mexican American War, 1848, to the beginning of the Civil War, 1861. And people can't really ever remember the Mexican American War, and people can't seem to forget the Civil War. So we got to think about where the United States finds itself in 1848. Okay, it's got this new land. Gold has just been found in California. It's going to turn into the gold rush in 1849. And it really puts, either on the doorstep of the Civil War or sort of this fast track through the 13 years of the Civil War, because again, these questions of slavery have divided the country. You've got the Louisiana Purchase, which created all this slave land, combined with the cotton gin, which really, made slavery, brought it back to life in many ways. And then you've got the Missouri Compromise in 1820. You've got Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, along with the Liberator in 1831 with William Lloyd Garrison. You've got the gag rule by Congress that says you can't talk about slavery in the 1830s. It's just a country that seems to be really focused on slavery. Southerners want it. Northerners are torn because morally they don't like it, but in many cases they need it for the economy. Now, we really want to think of this era as, what finally breaks this country in a way that we'd sort of seen coming ever since we had two developments, one in Mass Bay and the other in Virginia. We've sort of been heading towards this since the early 1600s. Now, in some way, shape, or form, everything links back to sort of three core ideas or laws. And one is this idea of popular sovereignty, which I mentioned in the last lecture. Lewis Cass brought it up as the Democratic candidate in 1848. What to do with the Mexican Cession? He's like, listen, just let the people decide. Like, that's the easiest thing. So it comes up with him after the Mexican-American War. It's going to be a major part of the Compromise of 1850. It's going to be part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then it's going to come up in a famous debate between Lincoln and Stephen Douglas over a senatorial race in 1858 in Illinois, the Freeport Doctrine. The Fugitive Slave Law, or at least I should say a new Fugitive Slave Law, a more strict one, is involved in the Compromise of 1850. It's the inspiration for the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then ultimately it becomes sort of disregarded by the North once they see what happens in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is ended in 1854 by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it's because of a goal of a transcontinental railroad. It leads to the rise of the Republican Party and also the end of the Whigs and the fracturing of the Democrats. It brings onto the scene an interesting guy named John Brown. It leads to violence known as Bleeding Kansas. It's going to be involved in the Dred Scott case in 1857, really important Supreme Court case. And then ultimately, right at the end, there's a guy named Crittenden who tries to come up with a new compromise that sort of brings back to life the old Missouri Compromise. So again, these three ideas, laws, sort of seem to have a ton of life throughout this 13er. Or you could look at this particular formula. Gold, California, a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the desire for a railroad line, Stephen Douglas, a crazy, fertile, crazy man, that's John Brown, who had many, 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 many children and was probably clinically insane, a free slave, Dred Scott, and the importance of cotton. If we can just sort of follow this story, all the way through from 1848, 1849 to 1851, 1852 to 1854 to 1856 and 1859, and then 1857. Those are all years that are important in terms of your quadrennium and biennia, okay, plus cotton being very, very important. Now, if we want to think about what's going on in the country in 1850, we're a couple of years into the 13er at that point, okay? California, if it becomes a state, would upset this balance. So it'd be 16 free and 15 slave. And you say, like, what's the big deal? Why one state? One state wouldn't change anything. Well, Southerners never wanted it to get out of balance, because if it got out of balance, then they thought it would be a slippery slope and they'd never get it back. And the House was always Northern controlled. And if the Senate was too, they thought, well, there's going to be the end of slavery. So in 1850, because of this concern about California coming in as a free state, what we call fire eaters, secessionists, got together in Nashville. Now, this is, again, about a decade before secession actually happens. But just to show you, people are already talking in 1850 about, let's think about dividing this country. Now, at the time, the Underground Railroad had been operating. Again, we'll talk more about that later. But it's going to sort of pick up its pace, if you will, as a result of these events. And there's also what we call personal liberty laws. And we'll talk about those in relationship to the Fugitive Slave Law. But even prior to the Fugitive Slave Law, the new one in 1850, there were states that were passing laws that were really trying to sort of stick it to the South. And we'll talk about that more right now. So the Underground Railroad, again, when I was growing up, for whatever reason, I know it makes me sound really simple and naive, but I actually thought it was underground. It's not. It's definitely above ground, although there are many quote unquote stations throughout where people hid in, false cabinets or in, basements or barns or whatever. And the whole goal of the Underground Railroad was either to get yourself from sort of the northern South, that means sort of the part of the South that's closest to the north, to get across the line and ultimately up to Canada, or to just try to get out of the country, sometimes even into Florida or places like that, to try to get free. Now, what I want you to understand is there's no like official Underground Railroad organization. It's not like you could just find the, UR headquarters in New York City. It wasn't run by any single organization or person, but it was many people, whites and blacks, oftentimes upper middle class whites, who sort of aided fugitives, even if they weren't necessarily part of some official organization. And, in my mind, for whatever reason, I was thinking tens, if not hundreds of thousands. No, it's a few thousands of slaves northward every year, which makes sense because you're literally doing this with just a few slaves at a time. And it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous, because oftentimes what happened is free blacks or runaway slaves would come back into the South because they knew the area so well. They would help the escape, and they would help them move literally just, miles at a time at night from station to station. And again, the most famous conductor is, of course, Harriet Tubman. Okay. But what you also have when these runaway slaves get to cities are something known as vigilance committees, where, again, if you show up and you're a slave, you don't want to look like a slave. You want to be able to improve your appearance so you look like you're a free black person. And the goal is also ultimately to try to get you out of those cities across the border into Canada, because Canada was truly free. So what we're seeing here are, the Underground Railroad and vigilance committees are not some sort of formal organization, but they're efforts by middle and upper middle class white people, as well as freed blacks and runaway slaves, who were really working to undermine the institution of slavery. Now, we have to understand that in 1850, California has applied for statehood. And you have a number of sort of old school, like OG senators who we've seen from before, like Clay and Calhoun and Daniel Webster. And they've got a perspective on what to do. And then you've got like an NG, a new guard, this guy named William Seward, who's got a different perspective. So the Crypt Keeper, the great compromiser and great loser, Henry Clay, he's like, we need compromise. Like both the North and the South need to find a way to compromise. Of course, he would say that he's the great compromiser. But he did say, at the end of the day, like the North should enact a more strict fugitive slave law. Like it's just unfair, he said, that property, quote unquote, can just leave and not have to be returned. Well, John C. Calhoun, we remember him, from, back with the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. He's a true South Carolinian. And he's like, listen, the only way to keep this country together is like leave the South alone, return the runaway slaves. And he even had this idea of electing two presidents, one from the North and one from the South, each with veto power. Now, it sounds like he's really pro-South, which he is. But the reason he's pro-South is he's like, how can we keep this country together? Give the South what it wants. And then Daniel Webster, who's a Northerner. The other two, Clay is from Kentucky, Calhoun's from South Carolina. Webster's from Massachusetts. And everybody thought he was like going to come down hard and be like, abolition all the way. But he didn't. He gave this really bizarre speech called the 7th of March speech, where he goes, you know what? It's sort of what we call a moot point. Because if you look at the land that was gained in the Mexican cession, look at the climate, look at the geography, look at the topography, it couldn't be slave land. So, like, Congress shouldn't even do anything about it. Like, let's just let it be because it doesn't really matter. Now, he was seen as a real sellout by abolitionists. They're like, dude, you're from Massachusetts. And you're like, just let it be. You should come down really hard on the side of abolition. But what Clay and Calhoun and Webster were all trying to do in their different ways is keep the country together. They understood that the country had been up and down through slavery through, really the first half of that 19th century. And they were doing whatever they could to keep it together, albeit from their own different perspectives. But then you had this new guy, William Hire Seward from New York. He's like, no way. Don't concede at all. There is one way, and that's the moral way. And slavery is immoral. And if you're a Christian legislator, which everybody was, you got to obey God's law, keep slavery out of the territory. So you've got these old guard guys who are like, all of them are pretty close to death. Calhoun is really close to death. And this new guy's come in and he's like, no way. Listen, if the South wants out, they go. It was a little bit like sort of William Lloyd Garrison with his Liberator some 19 years earlier. Now, it's all going to lead up to this great Band-Aid of 1850. And we've seen Band-Aids. We saw a Band-Aid in 1820 in Missouri. We saw a Band-Aid with the Compromise Tariff in 1833. We just, at the end of the day, like, the other earlier Band-Aid was the 3/5 compromise about sort of, how are you going to deal with counting slaves versus white people? And compromises at the end of the day are designed to make both sides happy, but usually they don't make either side happy. So the Compromise of 1850 is an important one, and you actually need to know all of the parts, okay? And you need to know which part favors which region, North or South. So California comes in as a free state. That's good for the North because it's going to be a free state, and it's going to provide, again, both in terms of the House and the Senate, free soilers or free staters, okay, to Congress. Now, New Mexico and Utah are two different territories, and they're going to have popular sovereignty. Now, remember, popular sovereignty means that people in the territory get to decide whether they want slavery or not. Now, it's pro-South in theory. Like there's a 50-50 chance it's going to go slave, but it's 50-50 chance it's going to go free. So, this is major part of the land that was fought over in the Mexican-American War. This is what the slaveocracy wanted. And the fact that it's popular sovereignty as opposed to not slavery is sort of bad for the South, but the fact that it's popular sovereignty and not free is sort of bad for the North. So it's sort of a push. The slave trade is eliminated in D.C., but this doesn't mean that slavery overall is eliminated in D.C., just you can't trade slaves there. So it's a pro for the North in that it gets rid of a slave trade in the nation's capital. It's a pro for the South in that at the end of the day, it really didn't do that much for slavery. But the big one that's for the South, and the only definitive one that the South gets is what we say is a stronger fugitive slave law. They'd had a fugitive slave law going all the way back to the Constitution's writing, but this one's going to be far more stringent. So I think what's important to understand here is that this is not necessarily an even compromise. The South only truly gets one part of this. And when I'm looking at this, I'll keep saying the marriage won't work. Like you can tell that like this marriage is coming apart and there's just signs throughout. And what we're going to focus on is the North is not really going to respect this stronger fugitive slave law. And it's just going to piss the South off more and more and more and more. And they're going to keep throwing themselves a bigger and bigger and bigger pity party. Now, skip this real fast. This is our man. This is Eric Foner. This is the guy who wrote your book. And believe it or not, this is what he looked like 30 years ago. He's pretty old right now. And he, in fact, is an expert really on the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is not the Civil War Reconstruction, but it's leading to it. And he's got a really interesting perspective on the Fugitive Slave Law. So here you go.
Well, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 is one of the most contentious issues between North and South. It's part of the Compromise of 1850, which included some pro-Northern and some pro-Southern measures, and this was the most important pro-Southern part of the compromise. Now, the right of Southerners to get back their fugitive slaves is in the Constitution, so there's no doubt about that. The Constitution would never have been ratified in the first place by the South if it didn't include a clause saying that these, doesn't use the word slave, it used persons held to labor, but everyone knew who they were talking about. They have a right to get them back. This is very important because it makes the whole country responsible for policing the slave system of the South. The northern states can abolish slavery, as they will do, but they cannot get out of their responsibility for, at least under the Constitution, for recognizing the legitimacy of slavery in the South and treating fugitive slaves as criminals, basically, who have to be returned. Now, but a lot of northern states eventually decide they don't want to do that. And in the 1840s, they passed what are called these personal liberty laws, which recognize fugitive slaves as people who, for example, are entitled to a trial by jury or things like that. And that's why you get this Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which makes it a responsibility of the federal government to go into northern communities and seize these fugitives. Federal marshals can do that. The Fugitive Slave Law is interesting because we always hear and we say that the South believes in states' rights, the South and the federal, limited federal government. This is completely untrue. The South does not believe in states' rights. The South believes in slavery. When states' rights is a defense of slavery, they believe in that. But the Fugitive Slave Law is the most powerful exercise of federal authority within the United States before the Civil War.
So this is a really important point, and he makes the point in his book that you read, hopefully. He basically is saying, it's interesting. The South seems to always get the reputation of being about states' rights, but what they're most concerned about is slavery. So whatever will protect slavery, that's what they're for. And the Fugitive Slave Law is a major federal intervention in protecting slavery. So therefore, a bigger federal government when it comes to protecting slavery. So what you have to understand is this new Fugitive Slave Law made every Black person in the North vulnerable. It didn't matter whether you'd been a freed slave your whole life or if you just recently come, on the Underground Railroad. Any person could really be claimed to be a runaway slave. Now, it's important to understand that the Fugitive Slave Law was truly, stacked in favor of the South. That was the whole point in the compromise. So it's a federal crime to assist in runaway slaves. So like to be involved in the Underground Railroad. It forced people, Northerners, even if they didn't want to assist in capturing runaway slaves. Now, it's a bit challenging to force someone to do that, but again, if someone didn't do it, they could be punished. It also provided a federal incentive, financial incentive, to judges to send runaways, and again, whether they were really runaways or not, back to the South, as opposed to allowing them to stay in the North. So it was like $10 you get as a judge if you send them back, $5 if they stay here. Runaways could not speak on their own behalf. They didn't have the right to trial by jury. And it also said, basically, you could arrest these escaped slaves. So that's really important to know. Not just could they be captured, but they could be arrested. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act inspires some real opposition in the North. The North calls it the Bloodhound Law, like they're coming to track them down. And as Foner mentioned, personal liberty laws were trying to help out these runaway slaves. And they said, you know what? Okay, federal government, you can't use our jails. If you capture a runaway slave and you arrest them, you can't use our jails. They are effectively not for you to use. Massachusetts went so far as basically they didn't fully do it, but they effectively nullified the law. So like nullification theory coming back. And they're like, we will not allow this law to be enforced, just as South Carolina said about the tariff back in the nullification crisis. And in many cases, you're going to have like mobs of people that basically go get slaves that were going to be taken back to the South and basically pull them out. And so the South looks at this and is like, excuse me, this is the part of the compromise that we got, and you guys are not adhering to it. That's not fair. So again, it goes to this whole pity party. Now, I want to bring up the case, and your book doesn't go into it, but it's a famous case of a man named Anthony Burns. And let me just sort of share with you, because I think it gets at many of the ways that the North sort of like openly flaunted their opposition to the Fugitive Slave Law.
A single spark can light a fire for liberty. Events surrounding a 19th century escaped slave in Boston provided that kind of spark. Anthony Burns was a Virginia slave owned by a man named Charles Suttle. In 1853, Burns escaped by ship to Boston, but his freedom was short-lived because Suttle soon came to reclaim his so-called property. Burns was arrested and held in the local courthouse. A crowd of abolitionists quickly gathered outside, and the numbers grew to about 2,000 people. A small number, led by a minister named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, charged the courthouse and managed to breach a wall. During the melee, a federal marshal was stabbed to death, but despite these aggressive efforts, Burns remained in custody. Determined to see the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 enforced, President Pierce ordered federal soldiers to assist the guards watching over Burns, who was ultimately ordered back to Virginia by a federal judge. More than 50,000 people lined the streets of Boston to watch and protest as Burns was escorted to a ship for his return to Virginia. Federal troops had to hold back waves upon waves of protesters. But things weren't over after Burns was transported south. Even though they lost this round in the short run, it took holding Boston in an effective state of martial law and fueled an even greater resistance to the federal pro-slavery law.
So, what you need to understand about Anthony Burns is not necessarily that he was freed, although there was an attempt to free him, but just how strong the opposition was to what the South got in the Fugitive Slave Law, and what people in Massachusetts were willing to do and to fight the military even to try to protect these runaway slaves. So just showing the antipathy of the North to the only part of the compromise that the South got. Okay. Now you'll see here, this is actually an organization called the Anti-Manhunting League. And it told people, okay, if a slave hunter, that's the SH, comes onto a runaway slave, this is what we're going to do. We're going to come up on him. We're going to grab his arms and his legs. That's what you see, the A's and the F's. And we're going to surround him. And it's effectively like, how can we impede the job of these federal slave hunters to make sure that the South doesn't get what they want? Okay. Now, just very quickly, in the 1852 election, what you're going to have here is technically three parties, but really just the Democrats and the Whigs. And it's really the last time that you're going to have the Democrats and the Whigs run for president, because both of these parties are really going to die out. The Whigs are going to die out. The Democrats are going to fracture. But what's interesting here is that you have Franklin Pierce, great hair, by the way, also an alcoholic, like the big drunk Sam Houston. But what's important here is he's a Northerner. He's a Northern Democrat who supports slavery, as is the next president after him, James Buchanan. So it's interesting here. They don't get Southerners who are pro-slavery. They get Northerners. So you're going to have a Democrat in office. And in the same year, basically, that he's elected, you get Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book that's inspired by the Fugitive Slave Law. Again, Harriet Beecher Stowe is, quote unquote, a Northerner. Okay. She's never actually lived in the South, but she's been to Cincinnati. And if you've ever been to Cincinnati, it's right there on Southern Ohio, right near Kentucky. So, and it's got a Southern feel to it in some ways. But she writes this novel about the cruelty of slavery, and the North loves it. They're so sympathetic to this slave, Uncle Tom. The South hates it. The South's like, who are you? You're not even from the South. You don't know what you're talking about. You're like, this is total pure propaganda. Now, this is a famous statue of Abraham Lincoln meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, who later basically says, like, you're the little lady who started all of this, okay? But what's really important about Uncle Tom's Cabin is British and French readers love it. And they're really sympathetic to Uncle Tom. And so at the end of the day, they create this sort of public force that if Britain and France were ever to support the South, the people would probably revolt. And this is important because, again, the South had always counted on Britain and France to come to their aid if there was a civil war because of the need for cotton. So Uncle Tom's Cabin has this really strong response in the North, as well as this really, huge opposition in the South, but also support in Europe. Now, there was a response in the South, at least a literary one, called anti-Tom literature. Never as famous as Uncle Tom's Cabin. But what these books were designed to do was to basically say, listen, like, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay. You seem to think that you know about slavery. You know nothing. What you should know is that the North is a bunch of capitalists who are a bunch of, wage slaves. And it went back to the whole idea of just how slaves in the South are part of the family in this paternalistic sense, that they are, given a much better life. And so in the end, it's saying, like, you don't know what you're talking about. We need to tell our side of the story. But again, it just goes back to this whole pity party that the South is having. No one understands us. No one likes us. Everyone seems to be attacking slavery. Okay. So that's where I'm going to stop right now. Hopefully it's not too long, and we'll pick up more with the events of like 1853 and 1854 as we move forward in class tomorrow. Okay.